Hi, this is also a note which you'll probably be really glad to hear since it is late in the day. So I want to talk about inequality and HCI, and this is work I have done with my colleague Hamid Ekbia at Indiana University. So there's a lot of ways of thinking about what inequality looks like. I picked out of many examples one representation that I happen to really like. So this is a graph showing in that almost flat line on the bottom there, wages since 2008, since sort of the crash, and how they haven't really gone up. But if you look at the Dow index and profits, the wiggly lines, they are continuing to ascend, and this white space between these two is continuing to increase. And I think this explains a lot about what's happening in our current presidential politics. And this is not going away, so this is a continuing condition in which we are living. I was actually kind of surprised a few years ago when Thomas Piketty published his book, Capital in the 21st Century, and how we started finally having discussions about inequality and growing disparities in the United States and Europe in particular in the mainstream media. So this has not gone away, and I think this is a positive development, and I think it's something that we can pick up on here in our community. So income inequality is connected to many, many other problems. So in the U.S., not only do 40 million people in the richest country in history live under the poverty line, but 2 million of them are incarcerated. Our infrastructure is crumbling. Students end up with crushing debt. And the thing I think that concerns me the most is that as wealth becomes concentrated in the hands of a few, it becomes really, really difficult for us to enact the kinds of things we heard in the other talks where we can take meaningful civic action. So if you look at what's actually happening in local communities, it's hard to stop practices like fracking. It's hard to stop development on sensitive lands. Courts are increasingly returning anti-union decisions. So this income inequality is not just about having a bunch of poor people around, it's about disempowering everybody who doesn't have a great deal of wealth. Now, I think the problems are a little bit different in Europe, and I asked a couple of my Swedish colleagues if they could kind of generate this list for me, because I didn't want to do it myself since I'm not there. And here's the list they sent back to me. The things that Europeans worry about are, and now this is from a Swedish perspective, refugees and immigration, terrorism, feelings of insecurity, instability, the feeling that there's unmanageable change happening, very high youth unemployment in some countries, economic crises that are quite severe in places like Greece and Portugal. And I was amazed that they sent back this quote about beggars and child gangs. And they said in Sweden, we have a large number of Romanian and Bulgarian beggars, EU migrants, outside of each grocery store, as well as elsewhere in the subway and so on, as well as North African, Algeria, Morocco gangs of street children living outside of society and roaming central Stockholm and Gothenburg. So there's this sense that there's a change in the texture of our daily lives, and I believe a lot of this has to do with this increasing disparity of incomes. Now, what does this have to do with HCI? Here are some questions I think we could ask from a political economy perspective. Which class benefits from a technology? We have critical studies, we have feminist perspectives, and they're pretty close to what I'm talking about, but they don't really emphasize social class as a key construct. And there's plenty of theory that does this. So I'd like to see us, I know we already feel like we're doing everything and the kitchen sink in HCI, but I'm going to suggest that we continue to go in that direction because we are kind of forming this really new discipline, and it is informed by a lot of perspectives. Technology underlies everything now. So I think we do need to bring in theories of social class and try to understand how they fit with design and with technology. I think there are a lot of research areas, topical areas, we just haven't taken up. Like, I haven't really seen many studies of labor unions. They're really, really important. And of course, some people are doing this, but it's kind of an underground sort of thing. I don't see a lot of studies in our community of the working poor. What kinds of technologies would benefit them? What kinds of economic arrangements for technologies would benefit them. I'd like to see research on alternative forms of capitalism, assuming capitalism isn't going away anytime soon. The sort of winner-take-all capitalism that we have now is not necessarily the only version of capitalism that we could have. Why don't we look more at worker cooperatives, at benefits corporations? I love these things as potentials because the legal apparatus is already in place. We have the theory. We have even some practice. We could elevate these things and think about designing technologies for these kinds of institutions that do, I think, address some of the problems of inequality. I think we should start to study distribution as well as production. We tend to focus on production, which is natural because we're in a sort of engineering discipline, but distribution is really important as well. So our current political economy tends to distribute consumption but hoards production. We are, I think, really doing some interesting things in this area in terms of recapturing production. So the whole maker movement, the whole DIY movement is about bringing production back to us. How far we can go with this in terms of sort of breaking the mediation with corporate entities, I don't know, but I think it's really interesting that this community in particular is really looking at that. So that has to do with stuff. I think food is also important, and there were a couple of really good sessions on food at CHI this year, and I was really excited to see that. I had a paper with some of my colleagues on forms of alternative agriculture. So this is, let's produce our own food and think about how to not only distribute it more equitably, but how to get the production back into our own hands. Here's just a picture of polyculture in a community garden in Urbana, Illinois. It turns out that when you start kind of digging into the food world, there's a lot of really interesting things going on, and I would love to see CHI take up these problems even more than we have. So we can recover autonomy of food production if we put our minds to it. I think there are some interesting technologies that are needed. And we're really working, I think, on recovering autonomy of production of everyday goods. Samantha McDonald, who's going to be a new graduate student in my department at UCI, has looked at how algae, hemp, compost, and recycled plastics can be used to create the filament for 3D printing. And this is really pretty exciting because this is stuff we can actually get our hands on. I have a bunch of compost right at my house. So if I had a way to actually introduce this into 3D printing, I could recover at least some autonomy of production of my everyday goods. So how am I doing on time? I'm good? I'm not, oh, I'm out. Okay, well, there's a whole bunch of cool things we could study, and they're all in the paper, and here are some of them. I want to say one more thing. Sometimes people find the idea of studying inequality and all of these things I've just been talking about as quite upsetting and marginalizing, and this is going to be my last slide, but there is a wonderful paper that will provide excellent therapy for you that I want to recommend. It's by Bran Knowles and Alina Erickson, and it's called Deviant and Guilt-Ridden: Computing Within Psychological Limits. So they've been thinking about some of these issues as they have been studying kind of the radical end of sustainability for a long time. Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for this. Gene Hardy, University of Michigan. A lot of what you're talking about with political economy kind of reminds me of the work that David Hendry and some of his students at University of Washington have been doing around mobile devices and homeless youth. So how do you see connecting kind of political economy and taking it out of places like feminist HCI and value-sensitive design and kind of moving it forward and centering it around class?
Well, I think we need to become more cognizant of the theories of social class that are already there. I think most of us are actually a little bit on the naive end about the theorizing that has been done. So I think the first thing is to just understand the theories and then start to think about them and bring them into our design practice. I mean, it's a pretty commonsensical way to go about it. But I think we've been sort of bracketing off social class as something that we look at, and if we start to bring it in, things like homelessness actually look quite different. And so that's the kind of movement that I'm hoping that we will see.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.